of governance, political economy, and various challenges that Malawians are facing. But most importantly, we want to understand and find ways of how government can actually solve these problems, and also the role that we can play as Malawians in ensuring that we are supporting government in one way or the other, and also ensuring that our lives are getting better by the day. In this podcast today, we have our guest, Dr. Mcbride Nkhalamba, who is a specialist in issues of governance. I will not talk much about what he has done, but I know he has served in several boards in Malawi and also internationally. Dr. Nkhalamba, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the audience, for the audience's attention.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want you to give us a brief background of who you are in relation to state governance or political governance, anything to do with governance.
Okay, thank you. I think you've already introduced me. I'm a Malawian, someone who was educated in Malawi. I did all my primary and secondary education largely in Malawi, and thereafter I went to Chancellor College where I did my first degree. And from there I studied the relevant and related disciplines to the question that we are looking at today. I studied public administration in the United States. I studied international relations in the United States. And thereafter, I moved to South Africa, where I studied public governance. These are at advanced degree level. So academically, this is an area that I've had an interest in. It's not coincidental that I work in this area. I have long held the belief that there is a great deal more that we can do, Malawians for Malawi, when it comes to determining our future by re-examining our politics, re-examining what you call political economy, where we are situated in the world, where we are coming from, and where we aspire to go. So this is an area of interest, both from the perspective of academia on my part as well as practice. I've worked for a number of organizations. I've worked for a policy organization, I have worked for a development agency, and now I work for a governance entity of the African Union. So these matters are matters that I've worked in for roughly the last 2 decades. Political governance, economic governance, corporate governance, all these fall under the domain of public governance. And basically what we are talking about is the exercise of authority by a government and an administration or an administration. By that I mean people who are elected into public office. Okay. How those people exercise their authority in the management of national political affairs and economic affairs to the benefit of those that give them that mandate.
Okay. So with your background, more especially on governance, we just want you to give us your prospects. Because as you might be aware, Malawi has been facing a lot of challenges, social, cultural, political challenges in various areas. What are your prospects?
First, let me start by acknowledging that Malawi has a very difficult recent history. Mm-hmm. It may not be history that makes the news globally, but Malawi has always been classified as a poor country. This is by all major institutions, global financial institutions. They all classify Malawi as a poor country, and it's a very, very difficult position for a country to be in for decades. Secondly, Malawi, despite being classified as a poor country, it's important to highlight the fact that Malawian politics has been very progressive. It's one of the few countries that have been progressive politically since 1994, when we moved to political pluralism. We were a one-party state for a good part of the 30 years of the first government. I think for about 20-something years we were a one-party state, and in 1994, when we opted for political pluralism, we have actually made progress in terms of A, the political system, B, public institutions, establishing the public institutions that we need in order to have a democracy, and most importantly, the political culture. Malawi is one of the few countries, so to mention, that has actually seen real change in government. There are countries that call themselves democracy. They are democracy in form. They have a democratic system, they conduct elections, but you will be surprised to learn that in those countries you have had one governing party for decades. Some countries have had one governing party since their political independence from their colonial masters, so to speak. Malawi has changed several governments, several political parties. We have a very dynamic democracy, which doesn't make the headline because of who we are. We are not one of those anchor states. But I wanted to point out that there is this discrepancy between the progress we have made politically and the progress we seem to be making when it comes to economic governance. It's a very important distinction, and we have to discuss how we can reconcile these disparities. I also wanted to highlight that the work that I do currently for the African Union is work that was premised on the understanding by the wisdom of those who founded the agency that I work for, that you need to improve governance in order to realize gains in your development and gains in peace and security, so to speak. Very, very quickly, within the African Union, they have what they call a tripod organization in terms of its priorities. You've got development, you've got peace and security, and you've got governance. But it is understood, well understood, that for you to improve development, or to develop rather, and for you to improve peace and security on the continent, you need to work on governance. In other words, governance is the anchor for progress in all these areas. So this is why I've taken an interest to have these conversations with you, because I believe that if we have conversations about governance in Malawi, it is a very, very important starting point for any other objective that we have as a society, or as political organizations in the country, or as different actors, institutions, including private actors such as businesses in the
Talking about progress, I want to understand, you've talked about the dynamic democracy. Have we benefited from the dynamic democracy as a country?
I think now it's becoming increasingly clear that the relationship that was purported by those who advocated for democracy from outside the country, the relationship between democracy and development has become a bit vague. And I'm saying this because the evidence before us tells us that many of the countries that have been are now classified as emerging economies, that have realized serious, rapid, and inclusive economic growth, are not exactly the democracies that we know. I'm giving you the example of China. China has seen the fastest economic growth, and yet China is not classified as a democracy. So I think we need to confront the fact that democracy does not automatically translate into development, which calls into question. So what are the factors that we need to be paying attention to when we talk about economic development or development generally? So democracy is a political system that allows you to have individuals that you believe are suitable for office in office, but also ensure that those individuals are accountable. But that does not mean that it automatically translates, or it will translate into economic development. And this is the question Malawi needs to ask, because we have a belief as a society that because we are a democratic country, we should therefore be developed. And the evidence before us speaks otherwise. So it's a very important conversation to have. Democracy does not and has not necessarily translated into the development, or to be specific, the degree of development that we expected. There's been so many gains from democracy: freedoms, a greater sense of what the rule of law is, greater accountability by public institutions to the degree that we have, on comparative terms. We can say to a degree we have a responsive government, but on the other hand, when it looks at what we thought were the benefits of democracy, economic growth, inclusive economy, improved livelihoods, that is grossly deficient, and we remain one of the poorest countries, despite being very dynamic politically and as a dynamic democracy. So what are the factors? And this is the conversation that I think that this podcast should be examined.
If we talk about the factors, maybe I would want to understand some of the points that have led to the stunted growth in terms of economic growth in Malawi, because it hasn't grown really.
Yes, I think that a big starting point, and I'm calling it big because it's very contentious, it's a very politically contentious starting point, is that you always look at the leadership, the sort of leadership you've had in that particular period. And when you look at leadership, we are not just confined to intent of the leadership. When we look at leadership, we look at the quality of leadership, we are looking at their capacity, their agency, and their consistency in pursuing what are important economic development goals, or important development goals generally. We're also looking at the leadership in terms of how we have managed leadership transition from one leadership or one administration to the other. All those affect how you realize gains and how you retain gains in terms of development and economic development. So that's a starting point, and there's a lot of issues around that we can examine. But we also have to look at the society itself. The transition into democracy meant a number of things. It gave a different sense of citizenship. And a lot of people have argued that if you look at democracies, we have a very heightened sense as citizens of entitlement and rights, but a considerably diminished sense of responsibility and duty. And when you have a society that pays a great deal of attention to what they are owed and not what they owe the system, you have, in aggregate terms, when you look at the outcome, you have diminishing returns. And this is a very contentious political issue, because the politicians who engage with the citizens have a selling point, which is we will have a government that does this for you. Okay. They do not emphasize what the citizen should do for the government. And over decades, 2 decades of such rhetoric, in the case of Malawi and many other countries in the region, you have a result today where a citizen's most prominent expectation is what is going to be done for me. We all know that governments don't create economies that make a difference by direct agency. They create the environment, but they can't create the economy. The economy is created by private actors. It's created by citizens. And that's why I'm saying, and I started off by giving you the disparity between our progress in political governance and our progress in the economy. And this is one of the major causes of that disparity. When you wake up in the morning, you also obviously have a routine in terms of what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And it's incumbent upon you, the actor, the individual who is doing what you are doing as an economic activity, to re-examine whether that's the most productive way of doing it. So before you even start to question the context, whether we have a favorable environment provided by government or other factors, the individual must do some introspection. And the phenomena I've just explained to you, in my estimation, has removed that introspection. Individuals believe that they can do what they do on a daily basis in exactly the same way for years, and they will realize the difference only when the government changes the context. Okay. It's a two-way equation. And these are the conversations politicians are supposed to have. On the podium, these are the conversations we're supposed to have within the education system. These are the conversations we're supposed to have at the level of the family unit, at the level of the community. These are the conversations we're supposed to have in the key socializing institutions, including the church, mm-hmm. including the mosques, the madras. But listen to the rhetoric. Mm-hmm. The rhetoric is actually very little is invested in civic responsibility. And when I talk about civic responsibility, I'm not just talking about being a law-abiding citizen. I'm talking about you have a responsibility to be efficient economically. You have a responsibility to ask yourself, where does my money go? Where do my resources go? I'll give you a typical example.
Okay.
Pardon me for laboring this point. Ask individuals to contribute money for a wedding or a funeral. They will. Ask them to contribute money to build a school or a clinic. I'll tell you that's the responsibility of the government. They need the clinic, they need the school. And I'm saying this not to rebuke society, but go to other societies. For instance, take the United States, where the government evolved from the bottom up. You have had counties, they will have a sheriff, police department. At the level of the state, they have a state police, then the federal police. But if you look at the level of the county where they have a sheriff, you see that it's broadly and predominantly a community initiative. Mm-hmm. In other words, and in brief, what I'm saying is that there is a degree of emphasis we need on community responsibility and individual responsibility. That part of the equation, in order to begin to reconcile the progress we've made politically to the economic development we expect to follow. I have said that I am not putting fully and squarely the responsibility of this disparity on this aspect alone. I've said that there's a leadership aspect, but I wanted to highlight this because this is one area that individuals do not want to talk about. And those in political leadership choose not to evoke it because they want to convince the electorate that the solution to their circumstances, difficult circumstances, are squarely and entirely, they squarely and entirely rest on the politician.